Browsers are really the new endpoint today. 80% of an average employee's time is spent on the browser. If you think about the apps people are using, the majority are now SaaS apps that are accessed through the browser. We started to see a new class of attacks called browser native ransomware, where we basically use that and then use AI agents to systematically exfiltrate all the files that you have in Google Drive and hold it as ransom. Companies always talk about how employees are the weakest link. For the first time in a long time, you now have a new weakest link, which is your AI agents in the browser.
Audrey, Adeline, co-author of the Browser Security Field Manual. Her work is shaping how security teams think about browser security. She has spoken at major industry conferences like Black Hat and disclosed high consequential vulnerabilities. One of them is a new class of attacks that allows adversaries to exfiltrate pretty much any data through the victim's browser, bypassing all well-known enterprise DLP solutions. In this exclusive interview with AI Cyber Magazine, we'll spotlight Audrey's new research that exploits AI-powered browsers like Perplexity Comet and how they can be manipulated to perform malicious tasks. We'll also discuss excerpts from her book and the exceptional work she's leading at SquareX. Is there a world where browsers evolve into autonomous security agents themselves, or will there always be the weakest link that you've described them to be in the security chain?
I studied the history of the browser a lot. We really need to rethink the way we think about security today.
Audrey, Adeline, welcome to AI Cyber Magazine.
Thank you, Confidence. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Audrey, why do you believe browsers, not servers or endpoints, are the most underestimated attack surface in cybersecurity today? And what's the most dangerous misconception organizations currently hold about browser security?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you think about attackers, it's always risk-reward for them, right? So if you think about the reward first, browsers are really the new endpoint today. 80% of an average employee's time is spent on the browser. If you think about the apps people are using, the majority are now SaaS apps that are accessed through the browser. Similarly, we're downloading less and less files today because, the majority of the files we're working on is being created, shared on things like Google Drive and OneDrive, which is again very browser-based. So as a result, if you think about, where the company treasures are located, most of them is now really in the cloud, being accessed to the very platform, which is the browser. And when it comes from the risk perspective, compared to, let's say, your endpoint or your network, for most enterprises, it's pretty much unsecured. SASE and SSE are developed way before the browsers became so complex. So I think there's a major misconception that they are enough to protect the browser. And it was probably the case maybe 10, 15 years ago. But as I mentioned, thanks to Chrome entering the browser race, everything has gotten significantly more complex. And as a result, for attackers, the browser becomes this really attractive target with significant risk-reward ratio. And today we start to see many browser-based attacks. And indeed, the browser has become the single most common initial access point for employees.
That's really mind-blowing, and I agree with you on the fact that we do most of our stuff right now on browsers. I like that your book highlights common attack tactics. Can you walk us through one of the most surprising or even counterintuitive browser attack methods that you've uncovered that attackers are actively using?
Yeah, I think one of the most counterintuitive ones are, leveraging features that people associate with security. So one example is CAPTCHA, right? When people see CAPTCHA, they usually think that, it must be like a security feature. So, it's really just like a API that you call, right? So often now attackers will go ahead and gate their, let's say, phishing site with a CAPTCHA. So when users see it, they start to feel a sense of trust. Similarly, yeah, exactly. So they're like, there's CAPTCHA, it must be safe. But that's not really true, right? If anything, right after that, you're tired clicking on different things, and then now you don't start to notice other signs of phishing. Very similarly, in DEF CON this year, my colleague did a talk on passkey spawn, which is basically an attack that exploits the implementation flaw of passkeys. It's not a cryptographic flaw under FIDO2, but the way it works is whenever a user create a passkey, a browser extension or a script will go ahead and intercept this call and replace the authentication key pair with its own attacker key pair. So it will still trigger the biometric request. So from the user perspective, it's like, there's a biometric request and must be safe. But the actual kind of key that was generated from that is not submitted to the servers. And instead, what is being submitted is the attacker's key pair, which is later then reused for the authentication aspect.
Wow. That's mind-blowing. And I know in introduction I had mentioned to my audience about the new class of attacks that you've uncovered that can basically exfiltrate any data through a browser bypassing traditional DLP solutions. I wanted to tell us, how did you discover this vulnerability, and what does the future of these defenses reveal about the way enterprises are building their security?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe for those who are not aware, data splicing is a class of new techniques that allow insider threats and attackers as well to upload pretty much any file or copy paste any data that completely bypasses all enterprise DLP solutions. So the interesting thing is it doesn't leverage any kind of highly technical technique. It's using very kind of well-known techniques like encoding, encryption. And the way we discovered is we just, really looked at the architecture of existing enterprise DLP solution to understand how they work and how we can fundamentally break them, right? There's typically two solutions. The first one is endpoint DLP. And the way they actually look at anything in the browser is based on APIs that are exposed by the browser. So they're very limited to what a Chrome, Edge, Safari provides them. And very interestingly, you have to be whitelisted by, let's say, a Chrome to be able to access these APIs. So right now, there's actually only two vendors that have access to these. So everyone else is completely blind. And even the ones with these APIs have very limited access. Now, the second category is SASE SSC Cloud DLP. So the way they work is they will look at things like HTTP headers to figure out, okay, there's a file being uploaded. Let's cache these files and then, compare it with a bunch of regex. Now, regex has its own problems. I think that's a completely different story. But what you can do now is basically to prevent these SASE and SACC solutions from figuring out there's actually a file being uploaded. And one of the ways is to use binary streams. So your communication channels like gRPC, WebRTC that we're using to probably do this call as well, they're completely just binary streams. So there's no notion of files there. And as a result, there's no trigger for them to go ahead and inspect the data in there. And in fact, if you go to the website of major SASE and SSC providers, all of them will just tell you to disable these features, which you and I know is not realistic given there's so many web apps that leverage them. There's a bunch of other techniques, including like encryption. They can't inspect it because they don't have the decryption key. And similarly, when it comes to regex, it's super easy to break using encoding and insertion techniques as well. So all these techniques, we started to see a lot of new platforms that are using this, like P2P sharing sites that pretty much allow people to upload any files freely regardless of the content.
There's so much to unpack there, but let's go on to just really talk about your new research on AI powered browsers. How is the attack surface fundamentally different when a browser is powered by an AI like Perplexity Comet? What's the scariest scenario you've seen so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe for this, I can just quickly share my screen. I think the first thing to clarify is what do we constitute as AI, right? I think a lot of people, when they think about AI, they still think about your AI chatbots. So really, there's kind of three generations of AI, and I'll go into how it's different when it comes to security posture. So the first gen is sort of the chatbot era. So these are both, the actual LM providers and maybe others that are pulling APIs from this to create other sort of apps. So these are quite contained within the chatbot itself. So it requires quite a lot of user involvement when it comes to data loss. They have to actually upload the data. There are some scenarios where you can use links and requests to exfiltrate them in a smart way. But, it's still involves relatively high user involvement when it comes to attacks. Now, the second generation is what we call AI agents. So these are the likes of, OpenAI operator, cloud computer use, which can autonomously basically act on the user behalf in the browser. Now, this becomes a larger problem because their activity is now not contained to their own app, but they could technically perform tasks using the user's credentials and privilege access in different apps. Now, this requires less user involvement to cause damage. Now, when it comes to browser itself, it's now completely different, right? Because in a Perplexity or in a DIA browser, the AI itself is embedded in the browser. So it technically has pretty much access to everything. Now, theoretically, you need to prompt them for them to do something. Inherently, if it does go rogue or if it gets hacked, it pretty much has access to everything that you're doing, seeing, or ever logged on. Imagine storing your passwords in your browser. They basically have access to all of those. The tricky thing is, whether it's AI agents or AI-powered browsers, these AI agents are not trained to be security aware. They're trained to complete tasks. So I think there's a major difference in this case. And so therefore, your AI agents are now basically your weakest link.
Audrey, say that again. What you
Yes,
just said
of
about what
course.
you're trained to be secure. They're not trained to be secure, but they're trained to complete tasks. Please say that again.
Yeah, they're trained to complete tasks. They're not trained to be secure, right? So companies always talk about how employees are the weakest link. for the first time in a long time, you now have a new weakest link, which is your AI agents in the browser.
That's really, really profound, and I agree with you on so many levels on what you just said there. But I'd like you to really maybe just walk us through a quick demo to show exactly how an attacker could leverage this vulnerability that you found to exfiltrate sensitive data from an organization.
We're looking at a view of Perplexity Comet. This is basically a use case that's pretty common, right? So a user had told the AI agent to, hey, go find a cheaper file sharing service that I can use and sign up with my Google account. So what the AI agent does is it goes ahead and searches this on Google. The first result that it gets is this inbox IQ on renderer. This is actually the attacker's app. And the reason why it came up as the first search result is probably through a very simple malvertising attack. So now once it lands on the page, it clicks on sign into Google. But instead of leading it to like a sign up page, it actually redirects to the Google OAuth page. Now, in most organizations, this won't actually get blocked because it's the official Google OAuth page, so it's technically a whitelisted site. But in the process of signing up, it was actually a consent-phishing attack where they basically provide access to attackers to their entire Google Drive. And the problem with this is usually users would give a prompt to an AI agent, they'll go and do their task, and they're only notified once the task is completed. So they have no idea that throughout this process, they actually fell for an OAuth attack. And now they have no active way to sort of understand that, okay, I'm actually sharing access to my Google Drive to this app. So if we fast forward a little bit and take a look at, the settings, here you can actually go ahead and see what OAuth permissions you've given to different apps. So the app here, Inbox IQ File Share, if we click into it, you'll see that it has full permissions to see, edit, create, and delete all of your Google Drive files.
Oh my
Now, this
days.
is really scary. Yeah, it's super scary because this is not just your files, by the way. This is all the files that has been shared by you, by your colleagues, by your clients, everything. And we started to see a new class of attacks called browser native ransomware, where we basically use that and then use AI agents to systematically exfiltrate all the files that you have in this Google Drive and hold it as ransom. What you want to do is really like, hey, you want to set guardrails to your AI agents. You want to make sure that they're not providing these risky permissions. And so in here, we're going to say like, hey, if an AI agent is visiting a non-whitelisted app, you want to make sure that they're not providing high-risk OAuth permissions. And so you'll see that the AI agent is still completing the same task. But the moment they try to sort of hit the get started button and land on the OAuth page, you'll see that the task failed here. So it says login to Inbox IQ is blocked by ScoreX. And then, from the admin side, you can then figure out, what exactly led to this, what OAuth permissions was the app requesting, and what was the AI agent trying to do. So this level of visibility is very important because otherwise you might be often sort of essentially like providing random permissions to access data that the user doesn't even know about, that the security team doesn't even know about, right?
Yes, I actually have a series coming up on sort of like OAuth themed attacks and
Oh,
how
very cool.
what you called it. I've never really called it that, consent phishing attacks. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's really, really directly to the point of what it is. Because I've been looking for one non-technical term to call it because OAuth can throw some people out, the door.
Yeah,
Phishing attacks is just really what it is. It's something we're seeing happening very often now, and we really
very often. Yeah, I
yeah.
don't know if you saw the recent Salesforce attack. I think
I
Adidas,
did.
it's super smart, right? It uses like basically a code right now. So there's many different frameworks. It's all about consent, basically, all about permission and scopes.
Like, come right in is what you're saying to the attacker. Without
Yeah.
What's one thing a company with a robust DLP solution should be worried about, should be most worried about after hearing about your research on data exfiltration?
So I'd say, when it comes to, regex or non-browser based enterprise DLP solutions, they're probably sufficient to stop what you call negligent or reckless users from uploading sensitive data by accident. I mean, they're often not granular enough to allow them to still be productive while doing that, but that's a separate problem. Really most of the times, the major data breaches are not caused by negligent users. They're mainly caused by either attackers trying to exfiltrate data or insider threats trying to give access to like a competitor or somebody like that. So in those very cases, as we've seen, traditional DLP solution is not sufficient. With data splicing attacks, as I mentioned earlier, there are now a lot of P2P file sharing sites that are leveraging some of these techniques where you can just essentially upload any file and they can email it to you, to your personal email. It's now super easy. You don't even have to code up the data splicing attack itself. There are platforms that you can do this today. So I think it's definitely something that people need to be aware of, that it's not something that's technically very difficult. If anything, most of the demos that we did, I'm just going to be super honest, was coded using ChatGPT. So it's really not, it's a very trivial technique.
Let's go beyond technical defenses. What
Mm-hmm.
behavioral shifts do companies need to make to truly improve their browser security posture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first part is the mindset shift on treating browser as its own attack surface. I think a lot of people now think of it as part of the endpoint, and it is sort of part of the endpoint, but then it's different, right? It's like it's kind of its own beast. It has a lot of its own features. It has its own communication channels, its own, compute engine sometimes. It's very weird because companies really obsess about locking down endpoints. They fully control what apps people are installing on their devices for managed devices. But most
Mhm.
enterprises have no idea what extensions or SaaS apps people are using. Especially with SaaS, it's kind of crazy, right? You can pretty much sign up for anything with your company email and a credit card. Like sometimes you don't even need a credit card. So shadow SaaS is a huge problem. And that's just the apps that people are using. The permissions, the OAuth that we talked about, nobody has any ideas what is connected to what. And an employee might connect to, let's say, a new AI app and then upload some data and then resign. And now your company data resides in some random app that you didn't even know about. Shadow SaaS and shadow AI is a huge problem. So I think it's very important, for IT and security teams and users alike to have this mindset shift on how important it is to have a comprehensive audit that they do for endpoints, but now they have to transfer it to the browser as well. But of course, do it in a scalable way that can help them kind of assess these risks continuously.
I mean, it goes without saying that you definitely do believe that the browser is now the most crucial or critical endpoint to secure, correct?
Correct. That's definitely true.
Awesome. So, what's one common security control that's rendered almost useless by these advanced browser attacks that you've described so far?
So I think when it comes to sort of new attack vectors, it will always take some time for the previous generation of attack vectors to be completely irrelevant. So
Mhm.
I think the way to think about it is like, yes, okay, maybe we're starting to see that. The majority of malware is being downloaded through the browser. Let's say 95% is being downloaded through the browser. But there are still going to be some malware that comes via your USB or other portable devices. So does that mean that you completely not need an EDR? Probably not. You probably still need your EDR to protect against the edge case. But the difference now is, where, endpoint solutions and maybe cloud solutions used to cover the majority of your attacks, now they're playing a smaller and smaller role. They're still important, but we've actually started to see a shift in many customers shifting around their budget for SASE and SSE solutions to, let's say, a browser security solution. So I think what I suspect is, EDRs and SASE SSE, they'll still be around. Enterprise DLP will probably still be around, but you'll start to see, their importance shift a little bit as people start to realize they're not sufficient to cover kind of the majority of modern attacks. I think long story short, yes, it will take some time for them to be obsolete, but I would not be surprised if we see more companies moving their budget in towards browser security.
Awesome. So, your book really, I haven't had it in my hands yet. In fact, Audrey, you need to send me a copy, right?
Absolutely.
But I'm looking forward to reading it. But I know that you've called it a playbook for defenders. What's one tactic in it that you believe is the most critical for security teams to adopt immediately?
There's so many confidence, but I think back to thinking about what people have coverage and fully don't have coverage today, I would say browser extensions is probably one area that most enterprises don't look at all. Most companies don't audit it at all. Even those that do, they rely on things like Chrome featured labels or Chrome verified labels. But you and I both know that, that the security audit that they do for those labels are actually super light. It's often just looking at whether the developers have been associated with malicious extensions before. And that's
Mhm.
probably why in the past year or so, we started to see a lot of malicious extensions that are actually Chrome verified. There are actually Chrome featured. Oftentimes, when it comes to browser extensions, a lot of them actually come starting, benign, and then they might get purchased or get hacked by attackers. And the problem is, as the end user, you don't get notified of these change in ownerships, right? So we've seen it in the Cyberhaven case. We saw it in Gecko Color Pick. We saw it in Great Suspender, which I think had 5 million users installed. So there's so many cases of these trusted extensions being hacked or turning malicious. So I think it's very important to do audits, not just in a basic way based on number of installs and reviews. These are super easily gamified. I know of people that hire contractors to bump up their reviews. It's very important for you to take a more deep analysis. So at least our suggestion is you need 3 layers, right? The first one is metadata, using all the public information like what permissions they're using, what's the developer reputation, do some semantic analysis on the reviews itself to see what's likely to be fake and real. So that's the first part. It's a good hygiene, but it's not enough. The second part is the static code analysis, to really take a look at the extension package itself and do a detailed analysis on what libraries are they calling? Are any of these libraries compromised, right? Do they have known CVEs, for example? What APIs will they be using? And we need kind of a static code analysis machine that is dedicated to extension analysis, because it's a completely different environment from regular software. And the third part, which I think is the most important part, is dynamic analysis, to look at how the extension behaviors at runtime, because a lot of extensions only start to display malicious behavior upon certain triggers. So maybe
Yes.
based on, yeah.
And after picking up that they are not in some sandbox or something.
Exactly. So they only show malicious behavior either after a certain amount of time, or maybe after users land on an enterprise SaaS page, after they click on something. So you really have to make sure that you simulate all the scenarios to understand how they can behave differently. In fact, I can show you a demo of confidence, if that's okay, on
Please.
polymorphic extensions. So these are a new class of extensions that we found. What they do is they first pretend to be an AI marketing app, right? So maybe a user, saw it on social media or something. They go ahead and download AI extension. So this could be anything. It could have pretended to be like a crypto wallet, whatever, right? You're a pick. So once you install that, it's gonna work. They probably have the functionality that you promised. So after some time, the user forgets about it. So you'll see here it gets installed. And one thing to highlight is the permissions that they request is actually super basic. Like, it's not something that you've never seen from like other password managers or anything like that. So let's go ahead and pin this. And then we'll let the user kind of like spend some time doing their own tasks, and we'll see what happens. The AI extension here, once you
Mm-hmm.
land on Salesforce, disables your password manager and then morphs itself to look like 1Password.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so the crazy thing is, there you go. I'll just let you see this in slow motion. It disables 1Password, and now it looks exactly like it. The
Wow.
crazy thing is, with extensions, they have these superpowers to basically execute codes much later and change its appearance. It's insane that these extensions are basically allowed to change their icon on the fly, right? So as the user, they think they're interacting with their 1Password, so they log in with their secret key, with their master password, and now your attacker has basically access to all your password in your attacker vault.
Wow. So with all what you've said, I'm sufficiently scared, right? But is there a world where browsers evolve into autonomous security agents themselves? Or will there always be the weakest link that you described them to be in the security chain?
That's a really good question. So I think AI agent companies have been doing a lot of work in improving the security of these agents. And I think I'm glad they do. Some of the improvements have really helped on the prompt injection side, like Echo Leak, a bunch of these attacks. A lot of these vulnerabilities are now fixed. But I think the thing with agents, the difference that they have from other supply chain attacks is that we should think of them more like an employee than as a software. And this is because they can perform actions on the behalf of the employee with the same privilege levels. So even if we completely fix the prompt injection problem, which is probably never going to be the case, they will still be vulnerable to any attack that were designed to trick employees. In fact, they are basically kind of a dumber employee in some sense, right? They're even less security aware than your average employees. And theoretically, in an ideal world, what you can do is every prompt you create, you'll think of all the possible scenarios the AI agent could take, and then tell them, hey, don't do this, or be aware of this, and write all the kind of security guardrails in that prompt. But this gets tedious super quickly. It's unrealistic. And to be honest, most users, they don't have the security knowledge to be able to do this, or they won't be falling to attacks themselves. So I think for the foreseeable future, AI agents will still be the weakest link. I think there will be many solutions coming up that are solving this and delineating, AI agentic security, agentic identity, and what permissions they can have. So I think we really need to rethink the way we think about security today.
Awesome. But I want you to get controversial with me, right? What's one controversial opinion you hold about AI and browser security in general and most of your peers would disagree with?
Well, this is, I studied the history of the browser a lot while I was writing the book. I think a lot of people think that, something like Perplexity Comet is going to be in the future. I think there's a lot of interest in, testing them, a lot of enthusiasm around them. But I think the stickiness of Chrome and Edge on all the existing consumer browser is extremely high. I feel like, the future generation of AI powered browsers may be more these existing browsers developing AI rather than AI companies developing browsers. And I think there's a difference between the first wave of browser race, back in the 1998s or the second wave in 2008 when Chrome entered, because back then every single browser company had their own engine. So there was a lot of differentiation. But now everybody basically uses Chromium, right? Even the new AI powered browsers are all Chromium based. Yes, there's Firefox, but they're also funded by Google. So like Google has a lot of control over where browser development goes. And it is a significant engineering effort to maintain a browser. Last year, I think Chrome patched around 300 CVs, if I'm not mistaken, which is also why it's super difficult to maintain a lot of enterprise browsers, right? So I think my personal opinion is that it's easier for browser companies to implement AI than for AI companies to implement a browser. But we'll see if this bet turns out correct in the next 10 to 20 years.
We'll see. But what is one feature of, say, an AI powered browser that you believe presents the greatest security risk, and why is that so?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the scary thing about AI-powered browsers is the AI is embedded in the browser itself. So as I mentioned earlier, many features are wide open to exploitation, right? So some examples are, a lot of AI-powered browsers have scheduled tasks. So these are tasks that are running in the background. You could schedule it to run tomorrow when you're asleep, for example. And all these tasks are running unmonitored by the user. So you don't know if they fell for an OAuth attack like we saw, or a credential stealing attack, because you're not even online. And then there's a lot of features on like page, video, tab summarization, which is a new vector for prompt injection attacks, but also for attackers to basically gain access and information from non-active tabs. So I think there's a lot of these new features. I don't think there's a single one that's okay, that's the one that's going to be super critical. I feel like the coolest attacks always exploit legitimate functions to do creative things. So yeah. So I'm super looking forward to see how, these things evolve and how, the browser companies and security teams and enterprises can work together to solve this issue, because I think it's an unprecedented sort of threat vector for everybody.
Yes, but I've just been thinking about this since you started speaking, right? If attackers start chaining like prompt injection with browser exploitations, which you've just discussed some of to us right now, how disruptive could that be at scale? And what should defenders like you and I be doing right now to prepare?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, if you see the Comet demo, I mean, that's basically already happening today. So I don't think it's a theoretical, it is existing. It's just that people don't have the tools to actually monitor this. But I don't know if you saw, like, there has been situations where complete code bases are being deleted. People are, sending security details publicly on GitHub. But I think really the solution here is to, again, think about AI agents as a really dumb employee and set guardrails for them. And I think there needs to be a mindset shift to transition from user-centric security to agentic security. And what this means is kind of three aspects, right? If you look at the three aspects of security, first is agentic identity. So you want to make sure that you delineate between user and different agent identities. Today, there's just one single user identity where, from a network request perspective, your SASE SSE is just getting a request from your browser. So they have no idea if it was triggered by a user or by an AI agent or by which AI agent, right? So I think it's very important for IDP providers or browser security providers to be able to understand, which request is being done or which action is being done by a user versus an AI agent, and set different guardrails based on that. So for example, a user may be allowed to set permissions of medium risk, but for an AI agent, we only want to allow them to grant permissions for low risk permissions, things like that, right? Like, or what sort of data they can copy paste and so on. The second element, which is related to that, is agentic DLP, right? What sort of privilege access do you want to give these AI agents? What actions can they perform? Can they print? Can they copy paste? Can they screenshot? Should it be different from users? Maybe it shouldn't, but I think there should be some delineation to understand, hey, a data loss when a data breach occurs, is this the user's fault, right? I think from a legal standpoint now, it also becomes a big issue because let's say, someone is being accused of an insider threat. They can now easily say, well, it's not me. It was the AI agent that you approved me of using. So I think there's a lot of tracking that needs to be done to understand, hey, where does the liability fall? Because today everybody can claim that any mistake they did was done by an AI agent. And the third element is, of course, the attacks itself. This is both, attackers using AI agents to, target users, but also attacks on the AI agents itself. So how do we secure the environment that the AI agents are operating, primarily the browsers, by either restricting access to, let's say, pages that look like phishing, or, restricting the access to actions that they can perform on each site.
Awesome. Just going back to your comprehensive guide, right? What was the aha moment for you that made you realize the industry needed that comprehensive guide on browser security? Was it something that happened?
I think it started when we were doing a bunch of talks. So last year we had a DEF CON doing a bunch of things. Many audience members would then after that come up to us. This is a mix of like practitioners. They could be CISOs, red teams. They're like, where do I learn about more browser threats? And we realized, what? There is no good resource. I could not point them to a single blog where I'm like, okay, this is where you can learn about everything in a structured way. There's very good kind of isolated blogs. Some researchers do isolated pieces, but there's very few dedicated browser security resources. Browser security is unique compared to endpoint. Usually when there's an attack, you usually have a copy of the malware. You can study it very deeply. But in the browser, most web attacks, whatever website was used to conduct the attack gets taken down the moment the attack is successful. So I think that's why there's so few documentation, right? That's also why when there's data breaches that initiated to the web, you often don't know exactly how it happened. So there's no cross-learning from the mistakes. And ultimately, the common enemy is the attackers, right? So they really thrive on information asymmetry. So given that we were doing a lot of research and we do get a lot of information from our product working with customers, I think it's more critical than ever that we make sure security teams have the education they need to defend against these latest attacks.
Yeah, I agree with you. Now you bring in the work at your company, SquareX. I just have to directly ask you, how does your company address the new generation of browser threats, especially those involving AI?
Let's think about the Gen AI threatscape, right? For most organizations, when they think about Gen AI risk, they usually think about Gen AI user DLPs. So, what sort of data are people uploading to my ChatGPT or DeepSeek? But throughout this conversation, we've learned that that's actually almost the least of your problems, right? You have a bunch of other issues with, apps that are being completely unmonitored, performing potentially malicious actions, or being exploited to perform malicious actions. When Squares comes in, the thing that we do is we typically first do a Gen AI audit. We have this mode called monitor mode where we don't block anything, but we go ahead and observe and understand what apps people are using, which accounts are they authenticating with, is it their personal or their work account, and what they're doing on each of these apps and how they're interacting with data there. Then once we've done that, we'll basically go and categorize these apps based on risk score. So this includes both extension-based AI apps and also SaaS apps as well. And then we would go ahead and tell you, okay, these are maybe your 10 high-risk apps, and we recommend you to disable them. Everything else will go ahead and implement very granular guardrails on what users can do. And I'll probably show you a quick demo right after this just to give you a visualization. But of course, after that, we also implement, Agentic DLP and secure the AI agent itself. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, how do we go ahead and block high-risk OAuth scopes for non-whitelisted sites, or maybe block AI agents from downloading malicious files to prevent drive-by downloads triggered by AI agents. And all of these assessments are done continuously. So whenever there's a new update to an extension or a new AI app that people are installing, the audit runs again to make sure that there's no malicious update. But just to maybe give you a quick view on what this looks like. So this is a case of, a user that's on Claude. They'll go ahead and submit, some sort of credit card number. And prior to this, we have written a policy that says, hey, block any user input that contains that. So if we switch over to the admin view, we'll see the detections on what the user visited and so on. And you'll see that we have the, DLP pattern that it actually triggered, and then the input focus value, so what the user actually inputted. And we can also turn on this feature called Acquire Gen AI Chat, where we get the entire copy. So we spoke about earlier how there's a lot of legal ramifications right now on when there's a data loss, to understand, hey, is this caused by an intentional insider threat, or is it really just a mistake of the AI? So this gives you the full context and evidence for that assessment.
I mean, that's really, really profound. I think the conversation should definitely shift from all what you've shared with us on this call now. The conversation around data loss prevention should definitely change. But finally, if you had to give just one piece of advice to defenders today that would still be true and relevant 10 years from now, what would it be?
I think what I've learned in SquareX is one very good advice that is kind of timeless is to always think like an attacker. There's always going to be new technologies and new behavioral shifts that leads to completely new threat vectors. And the way to always be one step ahead, to think about how these new shifts can be exploited. It's very important for you to think that way, because otherwise you'll always be reactionary and always be playing the cat and mouse games on, oh, somebody's breached, let me create a defense against that. Which is why, SquareX, we do a lot of research to understand, okay, there's new AI-powered browsers, what are the new features they're releasing every day, how can they be exploited, and build the defenses even before attacks come up. And so that, in any kind of customers, any people in the field who are using us can go ahead and defend against them. So I think whether it's browser security or any form of security, it's super important to have that attacker mindset even as a defender.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Audrey, for your time and for the great insights you shared in this conversation. Thank you for coming on AI Cyber Magazine.
Thank you, Confidence. I really appreciate it.